Hello, everybody. We're back. We're going to keep it really quick today. Well, let's start with where we are, who we are. It's the Blind Spot, Blind Side podcast. With we have to always remember to praise Junseth because he brought us this channel. Our cooperation made it happen in the first place. He's not here right now, but he will be eventually. But I'm also joined, excuse my croaky voice, by Dario Garcia, as usual.
Hello.
And we're going with an overall theme of cheap fakes. We'll explain that in a second. So let's start with the main question to anyone who is listening, which I think is zero. Can anyone hear my fan? Can you hear my fan? If you can hear my fan, because it's quite hot today. Last week I was moaning that it was super cold in the UK. Today's lovely. It's not too hot, but it's just hot enough to put my fan on. And well, I only have one fan. We need to. That's a joke. But please let me know if the audio is bad. But moving on, we're going to be swift because we all have work to do. So the purpose of this podcast, as you know, as we've mentioned before, is to review what we do in the Blind Spot newsletter and give a sneak peek into the topics we'll be covering in this weekend's output. But also, I think to give sort of behind the scenes perspective into what we've been doing and our news gathering. And I think a lot of people forget that journalism, we speak to a lot of people. Not everyone can go on the record. And sometimes we can't even say who we've been speaking to and why we know certain things, because otherwise we would burn those sources. And there's a positive side to that, which is that we get lots of interesting news. The negative side is that people who don't go on the record might be manipulating us. Nonetheless, if they're people of standing, whether they're manipulating you or not, it's still important that you know what they're thinking or where they want you, or should I say what they want you to think, as long as you don't bet on it. Which is, I don't know, have you heard about this scandal, Dario, in the UK?
Which one?
Well, the Tory party is imploding. It's literally imploding. Rishi Sunak's approvals just can't get any worse. But on top of everything, it's turned out a whole bunch of senior Tory figures, especially on the campaigning side, have been putting on bets, or at least put on bets as to when the election would happen. Because in the UK, there isn't a strict date that it happens. Every the prime minister has the right to call the election pretty much whenever. And so they did all this insider betting, where they miraculously got the right. You could bet on the day of the election, and they all won. But what's sad is that the bets, I don't think that anyone won substantial amounts. So it's really petty corruption. It's really disappointing. Do you have that?
I don't know. Maybe they should be allowed to do these kind of bets. No.
I just find it hilarious that I think Robert Preston said on Twitter that if he'd put that as a plot in his book, he writes political, thrillers or whatever they are, no one would have believed it. It was too absurd. But the Tory party is hilarious at the moment. What is the view of British politics from the sort of continental side of the pond?
Well, from the continental side, at least in Spain, all of the right-wing newspapers had a great view of Rishi Sunak. I don't know what it is over here, but there's just officialdom is extremely entrenched in media, especially when we view overseas elections. And so Rishi Sunak was a savior, and Liz Truss was horribly irresponsible. And there was absolutely no comment on why an unelected, uncharismatic bureaucrat apparatchik would not succeed electorally, which was fairly obvious for anyone who had an understanding of British politics. But the newspapers here and people are generally just surprised that Rishi Sunak wasn't liked and that Labour is going to be coming back to power, which could have been was pretty obvious for most people on your side of the pond.
I see. I'm very delighted to tell everybody that we've got zero 0 viewers at this moment. I wonder if I should tweet something, because I think we've come out now with the fact that we're doing these things.
Yeah, we've come out of the closet.
Let's see. I quite like doing these kind of secretly, but not secretly, but like on the down low, because then I can spread like little snippets of insight in a very selective way. So why don't we start with what we did last week? So last week the big thing was the fake news saga surrounding the petrodollar, and I explained why some of it was fake news. I mean, I don't want to dwell on it because it was kind of it's kind of boring now. But I'm just trying to find the right caption for this. I'll just put generic one up for now. The point is that there is no proof or evidence that there was a 50-year expiry to the petrodollar deal with the Saudis. And yet somehow this became, I mean, everyone saw that story last week. I was at a function last night with a bunch of analysts. They were like, oh yeah, the de-dollarization thing has become a big thing. If you read the story that I did on it, it explains the kind of wider context, which is really that this has been happening for a while. There's no evidence that, as I said, no evidence of an expiry. But also, I think everyone's got the wrong angle on this. I don't think de-dollarization is necessarily a bad thing for the US. I think imbalances are one of the reasons why the US has suffered economically in terms of the big inequalities, because it was dollar hoarding by China in many ways that created the imbalances that led to the offshoring of blue collar work, to China at the detriment of the Rust Belt in America. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. And I think we have to differentiate dollars that are held as reserve assets versus dollars that are used for trade settlement, because the two can coexist in the sense that one can be on the decline whilst the other one can be on the rise. I think as a settlement tool, dollars will remain the number one and go-to currency of choice for a long time now. But whether the share of dollar reserves goes down, I think it is a trend, but I don't think it really matters. I think it's better for the world to have a more fairly weighted reserve system. And the euro, of course, is also on the decline. In contrast, we're seeing a rise in gold, predominantly gold, but also the second point that we discussed was that China can only become a reserve asset if it puts out more debt. And for a long time, obviously, it had a closed capital account. It wasn't encouraging the internationalization of the yuan at all. But now it's issued these long just general yuan super, I think they call them special bonds. A lot of that is to do with the fact that Russia needs somewhere to put the yuan payments that it's getting for its oil. And it's very interesting that they're quite rare. The PRC put out a statement explaining this issuance. There's going to be 1 trillion yuan worth of these bonds that are going to come to market. And they've only done it in a few times in history. And in the next 4 years, there's going to be more and more external debt coming to market. And this is really a function of of the fact that China is going to have to take on a lot more credit to cope with its economic situation right now. Dario, tell me, do you know much about the concept of a balance sheet recession?
Not at all.
And I don't mean that to embarrass you. It's just that apparently this is a big talking point in China now. It's a concept that was originally devised by a guy called Richard Koo, who was a analyst in Japan, economist and analyst, and he applied that thinking to the Japanese crisis. And it's basically the idea that when the private sector has this massive debt overhang and it's spending most of its profit and revenues going into paying down debt, then the economy understandably stagnates because they can't take on credit. There's no mechanism for them to take credit on at least on the corporate side, without becoming bankrupted. So it's inevitable that the state has to pick up the credit expansion side of the equation. And that's what Japan was doing. And so everyone is now wondering whether the same applies to China. And I think whilst the Chinese are sort of a bit defensive about it, there is no doubt that China's government is now going to have to put out a lot more debt to cover the imbalances. And the real question is whether they will do it in a smarter way than Japan did, because unlike Japan, China owns most, like the Chinese government owns most of the banks. So they don't necessarily have to just maintain, they can do credit expansion at the very consumer level, whereas Japan couldn't do it like that. Well, anyway, so that was what we talked about. If you want to read more, read the newsletter. Then what was next?
Can I just ask, will this have an impact on making European manufacturing more attractive relative to Chinese manufacturing?
This, we can kind of move on to the big question. Let's do it like this. So the world is very complex at the moment, but by and large, what I see happening is that the European Western countries are gearing up to become more command economy-esque, because they're at their limits. Like, we all know that the debt situation is very sensitive, and anytime a politician comes on the scene promising to spend more, especially if it's unfunded, either it has to come at the cost of higher taxes, or the markets flip out because they see it as inflationary and monetization and all that sort of stuff. So politicians are now straitjacketed in the West. On the other hand, China is inevitably being forced to liberalize and open it because of this concept of the impossible trinity. It's going to have to open its capital account and probably let the yuan float. And that's an irony because it's kind of opening up as we are closing ourselves off. Now, to compensate for that, to compensate for the lack of credit that's flowing or available to us, there's this concept called credit rationing that's going to have to come in at the higher level. And this is what happened after World War II. I got this insight from speaking to Russell Napier this week, who is really one of my favorite investment sort of thought leaders. And he writes an investment letter, the Solid Ground newsletter. And his idea, I don't want to steal his funder because it is his idea, although I've been aligned with this thinking for a long time, is that governments in the West are going to be forced to do financial repression. And that means, just like post World War II, we have to be very selective about where we put the credit that we have available. And there's only so much credit, and we're going to have to be strategic and optimize. Well, we're going to have to be selective in terms of which industries to prioritize. So after the war, we obviously created the National Health Service, but it came at a cost. It came at the cost of not, that we had capital controls. We didn't have a very free market until the 70s. So there were capital controls in the UK for a very long time post-war. And that's where we're going. So we're going to have to, government is going to come in and start directing credit and putting it into what they perceive as the growth industries for tomorrow, the ones that can sort of snap us out of the stagnation. And the sectors they've identified as getting credit are anything to do with energy transition, defense, and I guess strategic autonomy. So that's where I answer your question, Dario. Strategic autonomy means pulling back jobs from China, and I guess building up. Well, it's like an opportunity to put in the technical advancements that we would have done had we never outsourced to China. So back in the 80s, 90s, when we were talking about lights out manufacturing, never happened because China came on the scene and we were able to take advantage of all that cheap labor. So it made it uncompetitive to invest in technical solutions. But now we want to bring manufacturing back onshore, but we're probably going to do it in a very highly automated way, and in the name of strategic autonomy. That's the idea. Does that answer the question?
It does, yes, and it obviously makes it, the way you put it, putting government in charge of these three sectors, most of which, with the exception of strategic autonomy, but also strategic autonomy, are probably the most resource wasting, corrupt sectors that basically rely on government contracts to eke out a margin. And it also reminds me of when the Ottoman Empire, in like the late 19th century, tried to stop its stagnation by doing exactly this. And they brought in like British train operators and the British train and British people to create factories. And they really did an effort to industrialize, but it went absolutely nowhere because the industrialized goods were made at a much higher cost, and they could just import Turkish textile manufacturers, and Middle Eastern clients could just import from Britain and France for a third of the price. And so it went nowhere, and it was just a huge waste of funds.
That's really interesting. I don't know anything about that, so that is something to look into. But yeah, I think what Napier is getting to is that politicians are going to be faced with these two choices, and one is that we essentially give up on free markets, and we enter a very repressive era where, in the name of getting ourselves out of the stagnation, we have to take sacrifices in terms of where money flows. Interestingly, like AI is also one of the areas they want to put a lot of money in. They see it as something that will allow give us competitive advantage. I am really not sold on that. Actually, a good moment maybe to flag your drone. So there's a story out this week, right, about drones. Tell everybody what it was saying.
So it was interviewing the head of a German drone manufacturer called Stark, reminiscent apparently of both Arya Stark from Game of Thrones and Tony Stark from the Marvel superhero character, who in real life would totally be a villain, by the way. It's just because it's a Marvel movie that he's a hero. So his point was that that modern drones, which integrate artificial intelligence, should be able to keep humans out of the kill loop. And so what that's talking about is that in a modern military, only people are allowed to take the final decision on whether a target should be hit or not. And this is what's called the human in the loop system, whereas an AI and machines and stuff like that can take target identification, weapon selection, navigation. It can take basically all of the decisions, but the final button has to be pressed by a human. And so what this guy is saying is that this is no longer needed. And in fact, it's silly to not integrate an AI autonomous killing capability, because then we'll just be leaving the advantage or the initiative. We're leaving that to our enemies or to China. And so his arguments for that is that actually artificial intelligence kill systems. This is so dystopian, by the way. Who thought we're talking about? This line that I just said was terrifying. That they can do a better job at identifying targets, at distinguishing between civilians and military people, and even at distinguishing friend from foe. And though of course he's right, and so he's putting it as this safety question. I think he may be right for the first month of the conflict, because the second that the AI strategy will become evident, and it will become evident based on who's being selected for a kill, it'll just lead a complete adaptation of the fight, where, for example, the military will dress as civilians, or they'll just hide their tanks as vehicles. So there are many ways that humans will be able to outsmart the AI, just like humans outsmart other humans, because when you're being hunted, it's the greatest incentive for innovation. So I think that there's an argument to be made that AI could stagnate much more quickly, because it won't be able to counter human strategies as well as other humans. But more importantly, it leaves us the question of who's responsible when the AI kills a child, which will happen, if not has already happened in Gaza, because of the similar story about the Israeli that the Israelis have apparently left the human out of the loop in the kill chain. So this is I don't know. It's a fascinating and terrifying question.
For me, I mean, I could spend hours. We should probably do like a dedicated newsletter on it or something. I just think there's a massive disconnect between like the corporate level people who come up with these ideas and the reality on the ground, and it strikes me as absolutely insane that people don't consider the unintended consequences or where this could lead to. And my other like pet peeve about AI in general is like everyone sees it as like this huge money making opportunity for corporates because they can like offload all this personnel, but it is a zero sum game. It is a diminishing return in the long run because it's like with the BlackBerry when it first came up. If you as long as you had it whilst nobody else had it, you had an obvious advantage. But as soon as everyone got it, you had no advantage at all. So those the corporates like moving in on AI are looking for they're after very fleeting profits. It's the same as with HFT. But it's going to be much less. I mean, because everyone's doing it at the same time, they're all listening to the same consultants. They're going to have like minimal advantage over it, and I don't see any productivity gains in the long run. And I've seen yet that we have had no productivity gains from technology just generally anywhere. I mean, it's absolutely bizarre to me that nobody appreciates that. And the technology is neutral, but if it is used by bad as much as by good, then any gains are eroded away because it's an arms race, as you say. Like it's an arms race. Like you're always innovating against the technology and or trying to come up with a way to get around it. So you're creating the whatever gains you have are immediately offset
and a really good example of that is this idea of the French before the French Revolution. I think this is the example that before the French Revolution, writing machines were very rare, typing machines. And by the restoration of the monarchy, they'd already come into play in the French bureaucracy. But instead of the French bureaucracy becoming more efficient, it just meant that there was a lot more forms and a lot more information that could be processed. And so it actually became more inefficient because there was a lot more work to do. And so I think that the second you put AI and AI inputs, and you increase the amount of AI inputs in the kill chain, you'll just make the kill chain so incredibly large and cumbersome that it'll be much more efficient to put a human back in the loop.
Now is, I think, a good time to pivot to talking about cheap fakes, which isn't really, it's a misdirection behind me because that's not the cheap fake that I want to talk about at all. I want to talk about Biden because there was all this footage of Biden, and this is what I'm going to write about essentially and explain in more detail. So Biden, I'm constantly astounded that there is this debate over whether he's cognitively impaired or not. Like there is a substantial amount of people who are happy to defend that he is completely compos mentis, and I find that extraordinary. And the latest, like what I would say is potentially gaslighting, is from the White House coming out and saying that the clips we've been seeing online of him stalling and looking, confused, bewildered, that they are cheap fakes. And there's and the issue I have with that is the sort of tactical weaponization of language to defend what is obvious selective editing at worst. So something that has been common practice in media across the world, selective editing, is now being flagged in the name of defending Biden as some sort of hideous, manipulative mind tool, which I'm sure, we all know it is, right? But it's not anything new. But the use of the word cheap fakes to try and get that story to circulate, that's the manipulation that I'm really pissed off with, because it is a direct connotation. You can tell it has been designed to give the reader a connotation that they're talking about deep fakes, right? That they're trying to suggest that the clips of Biden's are deep fakes. Like even if you on a subliminal level, right? So
Yeah,
cheap
for
fake,
sure.
deep fake.
Yeah.
It's mind manipulation of that sort. That's what really pisses me off about that, because it's insincere and disingenuous. Selective editing has been around forever, and if we are not to believe our eyes because we are only seeing the worst of Biden, right? It works both ways. You have to then dismiss absolutely everything on the media as a cheap fake, because everything is, there is so much edited just to show the best, right?
Mm.
So we do soundbiting all the time to serve our political views, our agendas, our news angles, whatever narrative we're trying to tell. So this is a slippery slope going down this cheap fake argument, because it's exposing that absolutely everything without context is kind of manipulative. So that's my issue with that. I'm going to write about that a little bit more. But what else did we do last week? We talked about which one?
France.
Yes. So you gave a very thorough update about what was going on. We won't dwell on what we, because you were also previewed it in our last podcast quite extensively. So tell us a little bit maybe about what the latest is on France. Has it got any less crazy?
No, well, there was this warning that we're going to highlight in this newsletter, right, about Bruno Le Maire talking all the risks that the left and right wing coalitions would have for France's economic situation, which is ironic because it's Macron and Bruno Le Maire's government that got it a downgrade, right, in its debt rating. But essentially, from what I can tell, there's just a continuous hype cycle for protests, and essentially they're being set up, or at least in the media, it's being set up for street riots that are almost certain to happen, apparently. But I don't really buy it. And one of the things that I really get annoyed, because I see the thing with Paris, France, that's unique about the country, is that you get attractive young people that shouldn't be interested in politics, and I really don't know why. It's really unique in that respect, because it's like cool and hip to care about politics over there. But the irony is that they're all shocked about the Le Pen's party winning vote shares because of their stance on illegal immigration, which ultimately should be a left-wing viewpoint, because illegal immigration takes away work from hardworking working-class families and competes with them for state benefits and these kind of things. Whereas the real terrifying thing that people should be afraid of with Le Pen's party is how, as an example with the Netherlands, they may just be a blank check for surveillance state, emergency measure, hellhole state, and yet that's obviously not being talked about. It's just about the racism angle. And it's like, how are we still talking about this after 12 years of realizing this is really a non-issue, a non-debate, because both the left and the right should be in agreement that illegal immigration does not, that only benefits huge corporates that are able to have these payments under the table. So it just really annoys me, actually.
I think on immigration, the idea that it was a fringe crazy situation in the, that only a fringe part of the electorate was thinking like that's now gone, right? And I think the other issue of immigration is that fundamentally it's inconsistent with any policy to defend Ukraine, right? Because if we are spending lots and lots of money defending Ukraine's borders, then and let's face it, like the blending of Russian and Ukrainian cultures is, I mean, they're so much nearer to each other relative to much of the immigration coming into Europe, right? If they can't get on and they have to have distinct borders and segregation effectively between those two cultures, why are we defending that but not our own borders? I think that is the thinking that a lot of what I guess the elite would think of as simple people. That's the thinking that they have not yet no one has properly explained to them that inconsistency and why it should exist, right? So they've lost trust. And I think in the UK as well, obviously Farage has come on the scene with reform, and he has, it depends what polling you believe in. And I think this is another big part of what we're going to write about this week is polling and whether you can trust it. Polling hasn't been as bad or in, as far as I'm concerned, like the biggest shock was in 2016. I haven't yet seen a poll be as badly wrong as it was back then. But I spoke to someone who, again, I can't tell you who it is because it was off the record, but it's someone who very, very closely connected to a company that got in trouble for hyper-personalized campaigning back in 2016.
No.
And we were talking about whether anything has really changed since that company got sort of crushed and taken out. And hyper-personalization in campaigning, apparently this cycle, it's not as much of a thing. Apparently they've all gone back to broad messaging. There is going to be more creative type solutions rather than sort of personal targeted strategies. That said, when we were talking about polling, their opinion was that polls could be very wrong, and that Nigel Farage might be seeing something nobody else is seeing, and especially the kind of Westminster bubble might be wishful thinking. They might be being, as I said, as I warned at the very beginning, I might be being manipulated. But I get a sense that there is a sort of anti-Tory, the Tories have had it. But I do think this idea of the supermajority in Labour, I'm not yet convinced that I suspect they will win, but I don't think it's going to be as landslidey as people say. I think it's going to be a very low turnout because people are just generally kind of fed up with all the parties.
And young people really don't like Keir Starmer, unsurprisingly, because he's another uncharismatic, charisma of a damp, wet rag style apparatchik that no young person really sees themselves in. He's just a state figure, born and bred. And I really haven't seen a single post of support for Labour, which is quite something because I went to UCL.
So very quickly on Macron, I think one thing. Actually, I'll leave the. Macron.
There's actually one thing that I just cut off with the internet, but with the polling, there's just to let our viewers know and your fan that are in Spain since Pedro Sanchez has been president. So since 2018 or 2017 or something, the polling agency has been run by a big partisan of him, which is the first time in history that our polling agency, the Centro Instituto Sociológico or something, so the CIS, which gives out the official polls that predict the outcomes of elections. And he's always been accused of front-running PSOE victory in every poll. And every single time that an election comes, the result is different and with significant less vote share for the Socialist Party. And the idea is that he uses these polls to bolster Sanchez by, because he runs a minority government and a feeble government, he can use this to kind of back himself up and claim he has more legitimacy than he actually has. But for example, for the recent European elections, he consistently forecast the Socialist Party as the largest party, when it almost always, at least for the last 3 years, before that, the PSOE would simply gain with a much lower vote share. But now it's just the PP, so the right-wing party, that is consistently winning. So in Spain, there's a very clear example of pollsters being used to protect their partisans. And then last thing.
In the UK as well. Go on.
We spelled Marcon, which...
Oh, yeah, macaron.
The word maricon, which is
let me Macron. I'm getting him for king. There we go. Very good. Thank you. Thanks for spotting. It's because I do these banners as I go, and sorry, typo. Macaron, we could call him Macaron. Macron,
yeah. Well, it's better than
Marcos, like Imelda Marcos. It was a joke. There you go. It was a really clever dictatorial joke. The the thing about the polling as well is the polling agencies now are all owned by, I mean, it really matters who owns the polling agencies and who is behind them. So in the UK, there's such a difference between like the Survation polls, which are the polling company owned by Aaron Banks, who is obviously the Brexiteer, versus say Ipsos or YouGov. That said, I wonder also if too much talk about supermajority just makes Labour voters lazy and they don't come out, so who knows what happens next. It does feel like the Tories are self-imploding on purpose at this point. I mean, it just can't get any worse. But very quickly, I also wanted to just flag this story about Labour, because there is now, I haven't read it yet, I only saw it this morning, but the FT's put out a piece about how there could be Labour could borrow more without UK bond market backlash. A new Labour government could raise extra money for investment from bond markets without causing a Liz Truss style gilt crisis, according to fund managers. Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves has promised to retain the Conservative government's commitment that debt as a proportion of GDP must be on track to fall in 5 years if Labour wins the July 4th election. She has also ditched an earlier pledge, blah, blah, blah. But bond investors said the market could be forgiving if a new government decided to boost borrowing, amend its rules, providing funds were channeled towards measures to stimulate the economy. Now, that is such disingenuous double standards, because Truss was also like that. The whole point was that she was going to go for growth. It wasn't like she was just doing unfunded tax cuts. She was doing it in the name of allocating that extra money for growth strategies. So it's Rachel Reeves has come in, and I'm agnostic. I genuinely am. Like, I don't care. I kind of hate them all, but like, I don't like that no one is talking about in the media that Rachel Reeves is basically just coming up with everything that Liz has said and repackaging it, and then slowly, like boiling frog wise, slipping in the same exact thing. We also saw Jeremy Hunt this week say pretty much the same thing. He said, oh, well, actually, Liz Truss wasn't wrong. We've been kind of trying to do the same thing as Liz Truss, but without, more gradually, is what he's saying. Now, if you're going to do the Liz Truss thing, actually gradually doesn't work in your favor. You have to do it really like a system shock. That's the whole point of shock doctrine. That is the idea. You go in and you push ahead with a big kind of like a defibrillator, if you do it slowly, it won't work. So I just find it super ironic. And Albert Edwards, who's a very well-known SocGen analyst, has picked up on this, and he commented yesterday saying no politician dares say they would borrow more in the wake of what happened to Liz Truss, which is, as I say below, had little to do with her budget. The FT were at the forefront of the establishment coup to depose her, but are now quite relaxed about Labour borrowing more. Funny that. Totally agree with that sentiment. And again, it's not about the politics. It's just about the double standards. That is what really pisses me off. And it was so self-evident that there would be double standards, because economically, what she was saying was not insane. Her delivery and her like communication strategy, all of that was absolutely appalling. I totally agree with everybody who criticizes her for that. But I have always said this about Liz Truss, and I've been attacked quite heavily for defending her. And to be honest, as I said, I would never have even voted for her. It's not like I'm a fan of hers, but I just don't like people being unfairly treated, and I don't think she's been fairly treated. And now Macron is facing a similar situation in France. It's really funny. Also, there was a paper out this week from the EU, on behalf of the EU, was commissioned by the EU by this like quite lefty economist, also like giving you the alternative to what the Truss thing is, which is a Gosplan economy. Again, like what we talked about, credit rationing and moving to a world where there are price controls. And the bit of the paper that really made me quite scared was this idea of the economy being managed through constant real-time data inputs. And that is the sort of that's the idea of the AI Gosplan, where where, for those who don't know, Gosplan was the Soviet planning system that managed the economy, over, the 5-year plan is the famous thing that came out of it. But now we won't need a 5-year plan, which, well, we might. They're also planning plans, but the idea is it'll be real-time data that now, unlike the Soviets, they got it all wrong because they didn't have the technology. So the rationale is Gosplan wasn't wrong. We just didn't have the tools to implement it properly. But now we do, thanks to AI. So we can manage the economy like like some sort of experiment. It's kind of
Terrible.
it's weird. So anyway, we're out of time. I think very quick fire. Anything else that you've got lined up?
Well, I just want to reiterate how stupid I think what you just said, that the assumption that these governments, are bringing in that just because we now have more information, we're going to be able to better manage the Gosplan. It's incredible. Maybe the more information you have, the worse it gets, actually, because it's all about how you how you get the information. And if there's a problem with how you get the information, and that's a fundamental issue to Gosplan, then this is all screwed. Because
everyone should watch Adam Curtis, because he was on this years and years ago, and he did some great films about this. Not even in the latest round, the latest Russia one talks about it, but he did it. I think it was either The Living Dead or anyways, he looked at all this Gosplan stuff a long time ago. It was really excellent. Maybe it was Pandora's Box, I'm not sure. One of those. Very quickly, I forgot to mention last week's. I ended up doing a big long intro into the idea that Labour, whilst promising no tax cuts, might actually, this is Peter Hitchens' idea, whether you agree with him or not, but I thought it was quite interesting, this idea that they're going to be doing more devolution, and so they won't have to do tax hikes, because it'll be the councils and the local authorities that do the taxing. So they get to be, we haven't raised taxes, but actually overall impact on families will still be higher taxes, but they'll be coming in from the sidelines from the local councils, and that because of more and more power to local authorities, which I thought was quite interesting. That's it, I think, from last week's. I mean, we had some interesting snippets here and there, but do pick up the newsletter. I always put little insights in there based on who I've been talking to and circling with. By the way, I did try to get a comment from Liz Truss about France this week, but I was told that she's too busy campaigning and defending her seat. So sadly, no can do. And I didn't explain last point, Macron for king. Why I was saying king is because there is now apparently a rumor in France going around that he might invoke something called Article 16, which is a sort of exceptional power thing. And I didn't know that there's a fear of riots, but if Dario, better than anyone, we've been talking about how influence ops and what do you call it? Strategy of tension, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Could be invoked to destabilize any country in Europe, to create a pathway for exceptional powers to be put in. I mean, you and I are classicists, so it's not something we haven't seen before, right?
No. Yeah.
On that cheery note, any last outlook? Otherwise, we'll close the show.
The Black Bloc is back in France, and so watch out for them, the anarchists clad in black. The last protest, they were not doing anything. They were just standing around and looking like they were refraining from violence. So if there's a strategy of tension, it hasn't kicked in yet. So
okay,
we'll see.
And do you think it will mix in with the Olympics at all? Like, so many people coming to France for that?
Well, I don't want to speculate. Speculate.
That's fair. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you everyone for listening. Take care, and we'll be back next week. Bye.
Bye.